Welcome to this first live broadcast of GFoRSS TV. As was announced during World Food Safety Day of 2022, GFoRSS committed to bringing to you a weekly programming related to food regulatory science and to offer opportunities to discuss with the stakeholder community, with our experts, with our membership, but also with all those who follow our activities, emerging issues in food safety, nutrition, and all aspects that may be related to the management of food using the instrument of regulations, and of course, the underpinning scientific disciplines that would support that. Today's broadcast will be dedicated to the management of food allergens. As you know, food allergies and intolerances constitute an important issue that is being faced by a number of people across the planet. There are estimations about the prevalence of food allergies. They vary between 3 and 5%. This proportion tends to be higher in children and can reach about 8% of the population. Now, food allergies are to be distinguished from other conditions related to potential reactions and adverse reactions, that is, to food products and ingredients, which are intolerances. The difference is really in the way the allergic reaction is triggered. And to put it simply, food allergies are generally identified or defined as IgE-mediated hypersensitivities. So essentially, there is an intervention of the immune system, mostly mediated with immunoglobulin E. We will be focusing, in fact, today's discussion mostly on these conditions, on food allergies, knowing that probably a 2-hour period will not be enough to cover the topic. And based on the input that we will be receiving from you, we may be scheduling other live broadcasts dedicated to this topic in particular. Now, of course, the material that is provided during this live broadcast will be coming to us from contributions of expert scientists, including myself, from the food regulatory science community that were made at a number of events internationally. And in fact, we take advantage or take the benefit of these contributions and make them available as part of hopefully what would be a logical program that will examine one issue. And we are very thankful to all those who provided us with these contributions for today's live broadcast. So what do we have in store for you today? We will be investigating, discussing the various facets of food allergen management. Obviously, on the part of the Food Regulatory Science Society, we would like to bring to you aspects related to regulatory management, and we will be looking at how food allergen management could be conducted or carried out using the regulatory instrument and what are the scientific underpinnings for that. Food allergens are also to be managed by food business operators, and we are witnessing intense activity in this area, particularly after the availability of a guidance in the form of a code of practice that the Codex Alimentarius Commission has issued in 2020. But of course, we would not be able to speak about food allergies and discuss this issue without offering the perspective of those who suffer from food allergies and those who care for them. And we were very fortunate to have the participation of a key advocacy group in Canada, Food Allergy Canada, which is the main association or organization that supports the protection of food allergic consumers in Canada. And Ms. Jennifer Gertz, the executive director of this organization, agreed to be with us during this programming and will offer us the perspective of advocacy and consumer organizations on how food allergens ought to be managed and what are the challenges to be faced. And of course, also offering a perspective as to the important role of these organizations in the landscape of food allergen prevention and food allergen management. We are going to be also looking at an important enabler for food allergen management, and that is allergen testing. And we will be dedicating a segment of our programming to this particular issue. Now, as we mentioned, all our programmings are free, accessible to all, and therefore they are open to sponsorships. And we are very much thankful to our BioPharm, a main food diagnostics company that has agreed to sponsor this programming, the first live broadcast of GFoRSS TV. We thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that this programming will be useful to you, and we hope that you will stay with us throughout the programming, throughout the 2-hour period where we're going to be looking at food allergen management. We will start this programming with a general introduction of food allergen management, positioning the issues of food allergies as a public health issue, and providing really an overview of the way avoidance can be applied as the main risk management approach and how regulatory instruments could be used for this purpose. This presentation was made at a symposium in a previous event and is brought to you as an introductory element for this live broadcasting. I'm privileged to introduce to you an update on the recent developments in food allergen management. What I will try to do during this presentation is to give you the current approaches of allergen management, how they were developed at the international level and how they were adopted by a number of countries. We will review a number of levers of change, and finally we will look together at some of the most recent developments in Codex standards related to allergens and some further perspectives for enhanced international guidance on food allergen management. Well, first of all, thinking about food allergies, this issue is a global issue, and there is an increasing number of documentations about the fact that food allergy incidents contribute to public health issues. They continue to be considered as preventable incidents, and while we are seeing a number of developments in the area of therapies to reverse these conditions, avoidance continues to be the most effective risk management approach. And we are seeing, as I mentioned in the introduction, an increased level of interest at the international level and particularly at the level of Codex in improving food allergen management. When we look at the public health impact, there is a documentation related to about 150% increase in severe allergic reactions that were documented between 2010 and 2016 in the United States. A number of other jurisdictions reported similar cases. But when we look at the impacts of food allergies, there are a number of factors and impacts that are not fully documented, and that's specifically in relation to the medical costs. So essentially the healthcare costs associated with food allergy incidents, the social costs as well, because we know that when an individual in a family suffers from food allergies,
the rest of the family generally has the impacts of that condition. The same applies to society, in daycares, in schools, where special care needs to be observed when there is a child that is suffering from these conditions. And of course, we cannot forget the psychological costs and the potential stigmatization that food allergic consumers and families may be suffering from. When we look at the interventions so far, and as I mentioned, there is so far no cure that has been fully identified as effective to reverse the condition of food allergies. And we continue to manage the risk mostly through avoidance. Avoidance meaning that those who are allergic need to avoid the ingredient to which they are proven to have this condition of sensitivity or allergy. And when it comes to managing the situations for prepackaged foods, basically the label of the food continues to be the source of information, and we need to have accurate information through the label. Consumers, in fact, depend on the information that is provided on the label to avoid the food allergen, and for those who are celiac, to avoid gluten sources. Now, generally, when we look at how labeling policies were developed, the main objective is to promote the trust in the information that is available on the food label. Essentially making sure that this information is accurate, it is complete, it is clear, and it is reliable. There shouldn't be any doubt. And that's why, in fact, in order to make sure that this measure is effective, that regulation was used to ensure that allergen labeling fulfills these objectives. And in fact, Codex standards, so the international food standards, were used for guidance to promote a good labeling of food allergenic ingredients. In fact, Codex standards were developed in the late 1990s, and in 1998 there was a standard that was adopted by Codex, and if I had to paraphrase it, it would be in this fashion. The presence of priority allergenic food should always be subject to declaration in the list of ingredients of a food label. And basically, the main issues that the food labeling standards were trying to address is situation where you have unclear information like flour, ovalbumin, or seasoning, either unclear because the word is too scientific, or because essentially there is an ingredient that has the likelihood to encompass components of ingredients with allergens in them. Basically, there is the possibility of those gaps or this lack of clarity to be lifted through a mandatory requirement of labeling. So essentially, if we take that example, the way the regulation of labeling fixed that is that for flour, you would be able to identify a priority allergen that is wheat. For ovalbumin, which is the technical word for a protein that is contained in egg, well, we will be mentioning the simple word egg that is more easily recognized by food allergic consumers. This could be done directly on the ingredients list, or it could be mentioned in a contained statement that is present also on the food label. And in fact, what Codex did was that it established a priority list of allergens that we call the priority allergens, and this list was in fact subject to the mandatory declaration. Of course, Codex also recognized the fact that dietary habits can be different. We have different diets, we have also different prevalence in food sensitization, and therefore this list can vary. And Codex directed one of its expert bodies, that is GFA, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, to develop criteria for the acceptance and the identification of priority allergens that would be subject to this mandatory declaration. Now, of course, in 20 years, this Codex standard was adopted in a number of national legislation or regulation, and a number of countries basically moved to have allergen labeling requirements as part of their mandatory labeling provisions. And we're seeing the propagation of these measures throughout the world. We're seeing progress also being expected in various parts of the world, including China, the Middle East and North Africa, and the Caribbean region in the upcoming period. Now, while significant progress has been made in the labeling of ingredients, we are seeing, however, an area that requires more interest and more focus, and that's the way precautionary statements are being used. So these precautionary statements, these are what we call the may contain statements, are used on food allergic ingredients. And this is an example of a misuse of these precautionary statements. We have a very simple food. Basically, it's a barbecue chicken. And we see here that while the list of ingredients contains 2 ingredients, chicken and salt, we're seeing that there is a may contain statement with all series of food allergens. And for the most part, when we look at this label, we consider that this list was not necessarily established with a good justification. So we are seeing, in fact, that as a result, because allergen precautionary statements are overused, we are seeing, in fact, that consumers are ignoring them, and we are seeing, in fact, that there is a higher risk for allergic consumers because they are potentially taking risks by consuming products with an allergen. Now, there was a renewed interest on the part of the Codex Alimentarius Commission in the late 2018-2019 with the acceptance of new work that led to the development of a code of practice on food allergen management that was achieved by the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, supported by the review of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. This is meant to be a guidance document that could be followed by food business operators in order to give them ideas about how policies, procedures, and protocols could be developed and adopted for the identification of allergens as an important food hazards and to dedicate specific control measures for this hazard. Specifically to look at avoiding or managing or mitigating cross-contact, the possibility of the identification of instances of undeclared allergens, paying special attention to the accuracy of food labeling, but also to provide accurate and useful information to consumers. What this guidance also advocates is the necessity to base these control measures as part of good hygiene practices or as part of a hazard analysis and critical control point approach using a risk assessment approach. So essentially, those measures that could lead to the development of an allergen precautionary statement need to be supported by risk assessment, and that these approaches of management need to be effective, proactive, and meant specifically to reduce the risk for allergic consumers. Basically, this guidance looked really at various aspects of food production and various steps in food production, looked at specific issues that could be encountered by primary production, the need to look at the way facilities are designed, how operations could be controlled, how sanitation measures need to be adapted to the issue of allergen management. Looked also at the issues of personal hygiene, transportation, any type of information that needs to be provided to consumers, but also any type of training that needed to be focused and dedicated to the issue of the management of allergens, and that needs to be dedicated and devoted to the personnel of these food production establishments. Now, as a result, in fact, of this added interest, we have seen the adoption of this text at the last Codex Alimentarius Commission, so the 43rd session of Codex, and this is now an adopted text. But at the same time, we have uncovered a number of areas that will require continued attention. First of all, these risk assessment approaches that are advocated by this text, well, there is a lack of guidance on the methodologies that need to be followed by the food industry in this regard, but also the availability of data that could be used in the context of these risk assessments, and also the possibility of providing some advisory action levels that could be followed by certain production sectors. There was also a concurrence on the part of Codex that more scientific advice is needed, and specifically in the area of reviewing priority allergens, but also reviewing the clinical information that supports risk assessment, in particular in the area of threshold development. And in fact, Codex also agreed to continue work in the area of allergen management, and particularly looking at new work, now this time dedicated to have guidance on the use of precautionary allergen or advisory labeling, and this was discussed by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. Now, of course, Codex work will not be happening in a vacuum, but rather will be supported by 2.5 decades worth of work that was initiated not only by a number of regulatory agencies, but also by the food production sector. And what is worth mentioning here is the work that was conducted by the Allergen Bureau in Australia through its effort to develop guidance documents that can be useful or to the food production sector, primarily on how to use the results of allergen testing and how these results could be incorporated in a risk-based approach that may lead to the decision of adopting certain labeling practices, particularly for the adoption of precautionary statements. A number of challenges, however, continue to remain and need to be subject to further attention. While guidance documents, protocols and procedures are developed for better management for allergen control, we are not sure about the adaptability of these guidance documents to small businesses, to small and medium enterprises that constitute the largest proportion of the food production sector. And we need also to evaluate the effectiveness of the policies of allergen labeling over the past 3 decades on reducing the risk, and particularly on the reduction of both the high impact incidents, so essentially those that are leading to emergency room visits, but also to the reduction of food recalls. Now, we're seeing lots of levers of change that are making us optimistic. First of all, consumer groups continue to be very interested in this issue and are advocating for more progress and for more enhancement in allergen management. We're seeing that food allergen labeling, certainly for ingredients, has become a known and applied requirement across the world. We're seeing more and more preventive controls, dedicating more attention to allergens as a particular hazard that is witnessed in food. We're also seeing developments that are quite promising in the area of cure, and particularly the application of immunotherapies that could be useful to reverse these situations of food allergies. And industry is becoming more and more educated and aware, and also this is leading to the propagation of a number of policies to protect food allergic consumers in a number of public spaces. Now, if we project ourselves in the future, we're seeing changes in the way food labeling is being developed, is being applied by the food industry and by consumers. And we're going to be seeing very soon the use of the Internet of Things, our smart objects that are used in order to provide us with the information that is needed on the composition of a food product or even on its condition of production. And therefore, there is a potential for using these intelligent tools to provide us with a personalized reading of labeling information. Personalized, basically this information will be customized to the state, to the health status of the consumer, and providing therefore a direct advice as to the suitability of the food product, in particular vis-a-vis a particular food allergy. And we're seeing more and more the development of consensus around the adoption of these risk-based management approaches of food allergens, and hopefully a better use of the results of allergen testing in the context of validating the effectiveness of sanitation measures or of preventive controls. And in application of these validation efforts, we will see how food labeling can become more accurate and more effective, and therefore more trustworthy by allergic consumers. We are hopeful that this momentum that has been further reignited as a result of the interest of Codex in more allergen-related work, that this will lead to safer products, to better protection of food allergic consumers, and hopefully to no longer seeing any documentation of fatal food allergy incidents for consumers around the world. I hope that this offered you a good perspective in terms of what has been emerging in the area of food allergen management, and particularly in where Codex has developed significant improvement and significant progress, and where the future direction is going to be. And I'm going to wish you a great meeting.
Food allergic consumers are those who are the most impacted by the issues of food allergies and food intolerances. And advocacy groups, consumer protection organizations, we call them also patient groups sometimes, are essentially the voice of food allergic consumers, but also of their caretakers, because we know that food allergies touch also a significant part of children and infants. And that's why providing a voice for the consumers in the way measures that are identified, that are put in place, and how these may be effective or potentially need to be enhanced for better effectiveness is a key element in the considerations of the management of this condition or of this situation. We are very fortunate to have had the contribution of Ms. Jennifer Gertz, the Executive Director of Food Allergy Canada, who will bring us this perspective, and also will speak about the importance of advocacy groups and how these organizations ought to work with the rest of the stakeholder community. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for agreeing to be part of this live stream on food allergen management. We wanted to have a little bit more insights on the work of food allergy advocacy groups and consumer protection organizations. And if you don't mind actually starting by introducing your organization and perhaps summarizing the work that you do to our viewers to advocate for food allergic consumers in Canada.
Perfect. Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to speak with you today. Food Allergy Canada is Canada's national patient organization. And our mission as an organization is to help Canadians who are affected by food allergy and their families live safely and confidently. And with that mission in mind, what we do as an organization is we focus on education and support for individuals and families managing food allergy, but we also focus on building informed and supportive communities. And lastly, we focus on being a national voice on key issues for the community. So when you think about it in kind of the regulatory world and the management of food allergens, this area fits into building informed and supportive communities because it's really important to us that the food system, including regulators, understand what it takes to live with food allergy and what it takes to manage food allergy. And so in that environment, we are helping people understand the necessity for being able to avoid allergens and how we rely on the community, including the food system, to be able to do that. When it comes to being the national voice, we then take it very seriously to say we need to represent this community when things aren't working or make it challenging for Canadians to manage food allergy.
Well, you actually shared with us how important it is to intervene, in fact, in regulation. So, and in food regulation in particular. So it's part of the, I guess, the mandate that you have to protect food allergic consumers. If you don't mind sharing with us, what are the hot issues right now from a food regulatory standpoint for food allergic consumers in Canada primarily, and perhaps actually also food allergic consumers writ large, where an advocacy group like yours, find it very important to intervene and if we might say even also to keep the pressure on food regulators to act?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we stand for as an organization is helping ensure people can get access to accurate ingredient information. That is the mainstay of living with food allergy, as there is no cure for this condition and there are treatments that are emerging. The primary focus to manage food allergy is about being able to avoid your allergen, and in order to do that, you have to have access to ingredient information. And this is where the work with the regulators comes in, because there's gaps in the availability for that information, or there are issues in terms of interpreting what's on a label. So, for example, there are 3 things that we are focused on from a regulatory standpoint. The first one is around making may contain meaningful. Okay, so in precautionary allergen labeling in Canada, that is guidance. It's not a regulated area of food packaging regulation. And it has been around for a number of years, but it has become so prevalent on food packages that consumers are going, how is this possible that this item may contain one of the priority allergens? And so because they're confused about whether it's actually the case, some of them are going, well, I think this might be legal liability. They're really working hard to try and make a risk assessment at the shelf to go, is this safe for me to eat? Is this not safe for me to eat? And then we have some consumers saying, I don't see a may contain on there. They must not have the allergen risk management practices in place. And so, what was a tool that was intended to be helpful has now become, somewhat the opposite, in that consumers want to know, is there a risk? Is there a possibility of unintended presence of what I'm allergic to in this package? But because they see it so much on every package, they're going, I don't know if this is true, and it's no longer becoming useful. So that is one of the regulatory priorities that we're working on right now, and we have a great collaboration of multi-stakeholders involved in moving that forward. The second area of regulation that we are trying to bring attention to is the availability of access ingredient information in online platforms. So COVID brought about an increase in people purchasing food online. Okay, and it wasn't like it wasn't happening before COVID, because it was. It's just that the attention around the lack of ingredient information online, or the inaccuracy of it, was not there. And what we experienced over the past couple of years is more consumers making that the decision purchase place, and that they need ingredient information. So we're very involved in raising this as an issue around, if this is how consumers are purchasing, and they're purchasing through online mechanisms, then that's the point of purchase where they need the ingredient information. So that's another regulatory area. And then another regulatory area that's more provincial and municipally driven is around food service. and around equipping the food service industry with the proper education so that they're informed and supportive communities, but also putting some measures in place to get access to ingredient information.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I've always said in a number of discussions that we've had with other colleagues internationally that the fact of having an organization such as yours is really the envy of the world. And as you know, a number of our viewers are from jurisdictions of developing nations. So I guess my last question to you is, what type of advice would you give to food allergy advocacy groups in developing countries when they're trying really to deliver on their mandate, on a mandate that is similar to yours, on the way they need to conduct business and how they can make their action effective in protecting food allergic consumers in their constituencies?
Well, that's a really great question, because I don't think that all advocacy approaches are necessarily productive. Okay, so I would say two things that I think have been important in our ability to engage on regulatory conversations and as an advocacy organization. The first is that we are committed to being evidence-based. Okay, we have a healthcare advisory board of leading experts in the allergy field that we lean on to make sure that as an organization we're as up to date in terms of where the field of the medical practice is on food allergy and where things are at on diagnosis, management, and ultimately treatment, because it's so important that we are recognized as a credible organization from a medical standpoint. And then the second thing is that in terms of creating change on a regulatory standpoint, on any issue, frankly, whether it's within school policy, whatever it is that you have to go beyond raising awareness. It's really important to be able to tell the patient story, because people listen to the story, okay? But you have to back it up with the evidence, and that you have to participate in a way that allows there to be a path forward. It's not enough to say, this is the problem. It's, this is the problem, and we have some ideas, and we want to work with multiple stakeholders who are also looking at this problem from a different vantage point in terms of how do we collaborate to move forward. Okay, and I think that is really critical, because nobody needs another description of the problem. They actually need the interest, the motivation, and the desire to get the right people involved to move the problem forward to a solution.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for speaking with us. And again, really thank you for all the great work that you do for the benefit of food allergic consumers in Canada and elsewhere around the world. Ms. Jennifer Gertz, Executive Director of Food Allergy Canada. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Food allergen management is also the priority of food business operators. And there are a number of guidances and guidelines that have been issued over time about the way food business operators, no matter what their size, need to apply their hazard analysis, critical control point, or other preventive controls to target specifically food allergens as a particular hazard that requires some attention. We will be looking in the next segment at some of the developments in this area, and particularly at the most recent guidance that was issued by the Codex Alimentarius Commission in this regard. This presentation aims to offer an initial overview of food allergen preventive measures as part of the practices to be advocated for being followed by the food production sector in managing food allergens as a food hazard. Now, in this presentation, I will review the approaches of food allergen management overall, and I will focus particularly on considering food allergen management as part of food safety management systems, and then we'll speak briefly about food allergen labeling considerations. Now, as we all know, food allergy incidents continue to be an area of concern for public health officials, for food producers, and of course for consumers that are suffering from these conditions and their caregivers when it is the case of children. Food allergy incidents are considered to be preventable, mainly through applying avoidance of the ingredient to which consumers are sensitive or are allergic. Avoidance continue to be the most effective risk management approach for food allergic consumers. And as was mentioned again, this area of food allergen management is witnessing increased interest around the world. And this interest is showcased by the most recent development of a number of work packages under the auspices of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. To date, we consider food allergies to be non-curable situations or diseases. And again, avoidance continues to be the main risk management strategy to be applied. And to allow avoidance to be practiced and to be applied, there is a need to ensure that the food product that is offered to consumers that have these conditions, that these food products do not contain the allergenic ingredients, meaning to make sure that the food is exempt from the allergenic ingredient if essentially the food does not declare it, does not indicate on the food label that the allergenic ingredient is there. And in order to achieve this level of certainty, or as much as possible, we approach, if you will, the minimizing of the risk of the potential presence of the allergen in a manner that is potentially unknown to the consumer. We need to make sure that preventive measures, preventive controls are applied in food production systems. We also need to ensure that the label represents the composition of the food accurately. So essentially accurate information about the food allergen composition is well respected such that it can be trusted by consumers. Now, if I move specifically to risk management situations in the context of food industry, we know that food industry management of safety situations generally can be represented by the following pyramid of food safety management. The foundation of the pyramid needs to be the prerequisite programs. Those are all the measures that need to be taken by a food producer in a manner that ensures, prior to even having the line, the food production line underway, making sure that those elements are fulfilled. For example, having the right infrastructure, making sure that there are sanitary conditions of production, making sure that the suppliers are respecting certain requirements that achieve safety and quality, making sure that the personnel is trained and is well aware of the safety requirements that they need to fulfill to prevent hazards being introduced into the food that is being produced. So again, this is the foundation of the food safety management pyramid. The heart of the pyramid is to be occupied by the preventive controls, making sure that measures are in place for those hazards that have been identified to be potentially introduced or to have the potential of being introduced into the food. So for those hazards that not only do we identify them, but we also develop preventive measures to ensure that they do not get introduced or to minimize the risk of their introduction into the food production. And at the top of the pyramid, we have traceability. Traceability allows
particularly to mitigate some of the risks if an issue happens and then the food is already distributed amongst a number of users or warehouses or even consumers. Having, in fact, traceability allows to act very quickly in case of a food recall. So those now, in order to manage allergens, allergens need to be considered as one of these food hazards. And as a result, the management of allergens needs to be integrated in this food safety management pyramid. And generally, we need to develop what we call an allergen control plan that needs to be integrated in the organization's food safety management system. And without having, in fact, this food safety management system as a key foundation for management of food hazards, allergen management will not succeed because it has to be integrated in the food safety management plan. And the ACP, or the Allergen Control Program, should leverage, in fact, all the different components of the food safety management system that is being applied by the food producer, including those elements of the prerequisite programs, such as, education, management commitment, the preventive controls, record keeping, for example, to support traceability. So those are key elements that need to be there and will have to be there if an allergen control program is to be implemented at some point. Now, I'm going to actually go and try to identify some components of the food safety management system and how we can integrate some allergen-related elements. So, for example, if we take employee education, well, as part of employee education, which is general set of knowledge base and requirements that food producers need to make sure that their employees are aware of, well, we can integrate some specific aspects related to allergen control. So, for example, making sure that, first of all, the employees are able to identify allergens themselves, that they will identify also, or they are aware of certain restrictions or certain behavior that they need to modify or they need to adopt to ensure that allergen handling is well respected. So, for example, that they would not be bringing some priority allergens as part of their lunches or as part of the food that they might be consuming, that they are aware of situations or the possibility of occurrence of instances of cross-contamination, and they are trained to identify those situations. They are able to be well aware of a potential coding system that might be put in place in order to prevent those situations of commingling or mixing accidentally a source of allergen that might be introduced in the production. A second example is management commitment. Management commitment is a key element of an organization's, of a food production organization, food safety management system. And in this particular case, we need to make sure that the management commitment extends to certain aspects of allergen control, and particularly conveying the importance of this hazard as an important hazard to be looked after and to be addressed by food production situations. Other aspects as well, prerequisite programs need to be reviewed and adapted such that we introduce some specific provisions that will tackle aspects related to allergen management. So, for example, the way, again, cleaning and sanitation should be in place, considering, again, looking at those with an allergen management lens. The way, for example, storage of ingredients and the management of suppliers would take place. This is part of the prerequisite programs, and making sure that in the suppliers management, as part of the various hazards that are to be addressed, allergens is one of those, and has, for example, its particular segment of the questionnaire that will be submitted to the suppliers. Preventive controls as well, preventive control programs, such as HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. Well, allergens would be considered as part of the chemical hazards and will need to be addressed by the questions that are to be applied in the context of the decision trees of these preventive controls and of HACCP. The same thing would apply for record keeping, which essentially is supporting traceability. We need to make sure that the way records are developed and are kept will encompass specific areas that are dedicated to allergen management. So you see, in fact, that the allergen control program is nothing else but accounting for specific aspects related to the particularities or the specific nature of allergens as a food hazard and making sure that they are addressed in the various components of the food safety management system of a food production establishment. Another important consideration that needs to be accounted for in the context of food production is to follow a risk-based approach. And again, it is advocated that food producers follow a risk-based approach for food hazards management, and this is certainly the case for food allergen management. The various components of risk assessment, estimating the potential health consequences of the introduction of a food hazard, risk management. If a risk is identified, then a certain number of interventions need to be made and applied, and their effectiveness needs to be verified. And also risk communication, that's really the communication amongst all the involved parties within the food production establishment and beyond, communication with the regulators, communication with the consumers, with the clients, and so on. And I'm going to actually take the next few minutes to talk about some elements related to the risk-based allergen management for food business operators. Generally, applying this risk-based lens will allow food business operators primarily to identify allergen hazards in their facility, but also identify their potential presence in finished products, assess the risk that they pose to allergic consumers. So, for example, looking at what are the situations that may lead to higher risks, what are the situations that may lead to lower risk, and as a result, develop risk mitigation strategies for allergen hazards that will be specific to their operations, that will be specific to their finished products, but that are commensurate to the level of risk that is assessed. Generally, one of the key considerations of risk management that is applied for allergens by food business operators is to use labeling decisions. In particular, to use labeling decisions related to the application of a precautionary statement. Precautionary statement labeling or precautionary allergen labeling, we use the acronym of PAL to speak to that. Those are decisions that are made in certain situations where, as a result of the risk assessment, we know that allergen as a food hazard may be introduced, and we cannot basically rule out the potential presence of that allergen. Now, this is in a situation where the allergen in question is not part of the composition of the food, meaning that it hasn't been deliberately added to the food composition. It's very important also that food business operators, by following this risk-based approach, they develop incrementally a body of evidence on allergen management that supports their operations, practices the effectiveness of which has been proven to be working. And as a result, essentially, they will use the most effective measures based on the experience that they develop in a manner that is adapted to their products. The same thing also, the food business operators need to update and enhance their allergen recall practices to make sure that they tackle situations where the food safety incident includes an allergen as a food safety hazard. Now, in terms of the risk-based approaches, we know that food allergens represent a health hazard for allergic consumers, but that the risk is not necessarily the same based on a number of other considerations, such as the exposure, but also the nature of the allergen. So the probability of causing an allergic reaction associated with the consumption of an allergen will differ depending on a number of considerations. And of course, the control strategies need to be proportional to the risks that are identified and characterized as a result. So essentially, we need to make control strategies mitigating those risks that are commensurate to the level of risk that is characterized. So if I go through the various parts of risk analysis here, and I take the first part, which is the identification of the allergen hazards. First of all, we need to identify allergens that enter the facility. And this goes with an exhaustive review of the specifications or the information sheets of the various raw material that are used in the facility, including ingredients, so single and composite ingredients, including, information that is provided by the suppliers, and making sure that the suppliers are well aware to identify in a clear manner the composition of the raw material as far as allergens are concerned. Second aspect of identification of allergen hazards, making sure that all allergens that are intentionally added to each finished product as main component of the raw material are well determined. So the quantitative aspects need to be addressed. We need to identify also allergens that may be indirectly added to each finished product as an unintentional component of the raw material. So these are situations where the raw material may have a precautionary statement on it, meaning that the allergen is not a sub-ingredient of the raw material, but again, its potential introduction could not necessarily be avoided. We need also to identify situations where the allergen may be introduced, again, unintentionally, so without being part of the composition of the food, but as part of the different stages of the food processing. So essentially, during processing, handling, and storage, and that, of course, may have a repercussion on the potential presence of the allergen, again, unintentionally in the finished products. So conducting what we call a vulnerability assessment and mapping the situations where the allergen is potentially likely to be introduced, is one of the actions that needs to be undertaken in order to identify the hazard. This can be done through the review of the production floor plans, the entire process flow, identify the risks, and through a documentation of the process. And this is an example of the way of allergen identification in a production facility. So essentially looking at the various aspects of the receiving and storage, the way the raw material is handled, the way the scheduling of the allergen containing ingredients are to be made, how the processing would allow or not the segregation of ingredients containing allergens or not, the conditions of cleaning, and so on and so forth. Now, beyond the identification, we need to have characterization of the hazard. And in this particular case, we are interested in looking at the potential health repercussions, so the severity of the reaction that is associated with the allergen. How would an allergic consumer respond if they ingest an allergen through a food product? And the severity of the reaction is, of course, related to the inherent nature of the allergen itself. Allergens would have different thresholds, and some allergens, like egg, for example, like peanut, would have minimum amounts inducing some reactions. Others, like soy, for example, would require larger amounts in order to trigger an objective reaction. And of course, in order to use that information in the context of risk characterization now, we need also to differentiate exposure scenarios. So essentially situations where you have the introduction of the allergen as part of an unintentional presence in the raw material, the way that raw material makes part of the composition of the final food, but also to identify the exposure scenario if the unintentional presence is related to cross-contamination or a cross-contact as a result of processing situations. And this is an example of the development of the use of decision trees, where essentially you have a vulnerability assessment that is conducted mostly to look at a potential cross-contact during the processing and the storage or the handling. And that vulnerability assessment is done asking whether the allergen is already part of the recipe or not. If it is part of the recipe, then essentially the allergen is a main component, and the declaration of the ingredient will take care of that. But if it is not part of the recipe, well, basically, we need to have a situation of a risk assessment in order to know whether a precautionary allergen labeling might be required on the label in order to address or to mitigate that risk. Now, again, if we go to the parameters of the risk assessment, severity is one of those, and we've indicated really the fact that allergens are not equal, and the severity of the reaction needs to be assessed on the basis of the nature of the allergen itself, but also the amounts. We can end up actually using a decision table like this, using first of all the aspects of the severity and using minor, moderate, and serious, and the likelihood of the introduction. The likelihood of the introduction for unintentional introduction, remote, possible, and very unlikely. And that leads to a sort of a qualitative risk assessment, where if you have a high or a serious situation of severity, and also a very high likelihood of introduction, you will have the most risky scenario. Again, now this is an example of conducting a qualitative determination of the risk assessment. And again, we start with the situation of estimating the severity and the likelihood of occurrence. So this is really using the information of that table that we had, but also the existing risk mitigation strategies in place that might mitigate the risk. And we conduct, in fact, a preliminary qualitative risk assessment. If the output of that is in the green zone, meaning that the risk is low and can be avoided, we can conclude that a precautionary allergen labeling is not required. If, however, the risk is deemed to be of high potential, so we are in the red zone, we consider that the risk to be present, and the conclusion may be that the precautionary allergen labeling would be required. If, however, at the end of this preliminary qualitative assessment, we reach a situation that is inconclusive, we continue the assessment by doing an estimation of the potential consumption of the allergen. So looking at the exposure scenarios, and we may end up with a full qualitative risk assessment. Again, the same situation. If the risk is present, PAL is required. If the risk can be avoided, the precautionary allergen labeling is not required. And if we are still in a situation of unconclusive, we need to conduct a more quantitative risk assessment that will allow us to make a decision as to the risk mitigation measures to be adopted. Now, from a risk management standpoint now, the recommended approach to manage allergen risks is, of course, to develop this allergen control plan. And the plan should be outlining for a food manufacturing facility the various components of a strategy to prevent or to minimize the risk associated with each of the allergens that are likely to be introduced in the operation. Generally, these are the elements of the allergen control plan. You have aspects related to human resources, For example, creating an allergen management team, developing specific training modules for the human resources training specific to allergens as a hazard. A second component will be about the supply chain, traceability, the management of suppliers, instituting, for example, requirements for raw material characterization by the suppliers as far as allergen management is concerned. Reorienting or essentially looking at the audits of some new suppliers, in particular for their allergen management practices. Looking also at the type of allergen management requirement or allergen information requirements related to shipments. So this brings me to transportation. Also the elements of a recall plan. So those elements generally are part of the prerequisite programs. Other elements of the allergen control plan include how you manage your purchasing. So essentially the reputation of your suppliers, the documentation of your suppliers. How do you manage your product development and reformulation? Making sure that allergens are always there as an important consideration in the way product development is. If you can avoid the use of an allergen in a formulation, that actually will minimize the potential risks. Another component is related to the way raw material are received and stored. The way the process is designed, so the manufacturing process, making sure that there are situations that allow segregation, both physical segregation or segregation in time. So essentially, there are situations where you are processing something with allergens and something that is not supposed to contain allergens. For the processing itself, of course, the various elements that need to be considered, the personnel, any type of changeover, the management of rework, the way you consider maintenance of equipment or maintenance of the facility. And of course, a special attention needs to be made to labeling errors and actively prevent situations of those labeling errors. And examples is really looking at the various aspects of labeling, from the packaging of the material provided by the suppliers all the way to labeling that could be applied during the operations. Risk management that needs to be considered also for cleaning the operations. How do you tackle deviation and having the appropriate procedures and the documented corrective actions with the root cause analysis that concerns allergens, but also the evaluation of the effectiveness of the preventive measures. Finally, risk communication is an important element of the risk analysis approach. The risks that cannot be avoided must be communicated to consumers, using the labeling, but using other means of communication, particularly when we are now in a risk mitigation phase. We know that there is an issue, the product may be out there, and we need to advise either other clients or consumers about the potential presence of the allergen. It's very important that we have accurate business-to-business communication because this is how accurate information about allergen presence is to be propagated throughout the supply chain. And various means of risk communication can be used, so certainly the label, but also digital communication channels. And nowadays, the prevalent use of e-commerce, including for procurement of foods, will allow new communication tools related to allergen composition. Now, of course, I cannot finish this presentation without speaking of the other element of allergen management that is applied primarily by regulators. Regulators rely also on the principle of avoidance as the most effective risk management strategy that consumers rely upon. Consumers depend on the information provided on the label to avoid the food allergen that is potentially present in a prepackaged food, because the label is the only link between the producer and the consumer when it comes to prepackaged foods. And that's why labeling has been used as an important risk management measure for food regulators with the objective to promote trust in the information that is available on the food label, making sure that we have accuracy, clarity of language, and reliability. We remove the doubt. Labeling is, of course, a measure that can be regulated, and that's why competent authorities relied mostly on labeling following Codex standards, but Codex particularly focused on the situation of labeling of allergens when they are part of the composition of the food. And right now, we are seeing more work as part of Codex in order to address some changes in labeling requirements for allergens. So the gap that needs to be addressed is mostly a situation where you have a potential cross-contamination or cross-contact, an unavoidable scenario of the presence of the allergen, and how we use precautionary labeling as an effective risk management tool. Because generally, when you have these situations, precautionary allergen labeling can be used to inform the consumer. But because allergen labeling has been used in a pervasive manner, sometimes without the application of a risk assessment that supports the decision to use or to rely upon precautionary labeling, we saw, in fact, situations where the more you have precautionary labeling applied on food products, the less essentially consumers will be paying attention to it and will be inclined to take risks. So you have more adverse reaction events that are being witnessed as a result of that. And therefore, we're seeing, in fact, that Codex has been attentive to this, and there was a movement to attempt to change food production practices with a better guidance. A guidance stemming from CCFH with the development of a code of practice related to allergen management, and that tackled the various aspects, the various components of the food safety management, from primary production, design of the facilities, control of the operations, maintenance and sanitation, personal hygiene, transportation, and up to training. And we're seeing, in fact, now this interest continuing with CCFL using the community of stakeholders for input and moving forward with the development of guidance in relation with the use of precautionary labeling. Now, the future, of course, will account for the use of these digital solutions, where labeling information will be provided to the consumer through the application or the reading of a QR code that will provide the consumer with the allergen advice based on the situation of the consumer themselves. And this is probably the future of the reliance on food labeling using digital tools. We continue to develop these tools, and there is still a committed direction from the community of stakeholders to aim for safer allergic consumers with limited incidents, making sure that consumers remain at the heart of the risk management strategy, and these risk management strategies are updated with the level of knowledge and the experience that is gathered, but also for the food industry to rely upon a clear and predictable food regulatory environment, basically making sure that regulators provide the right advice, particularly vis-a-vis allergen labeling. And just like the advice that was provided for the labeling of ingredients, we managed to have a clear advice and clear guidance, particularly around the use of risk analysis in the context of management of situations where allergens may be present as a result of unintentional introduction into the production of the food. I hope that this presentation gave you a general overview of some of the aspects that food industry need to pay attention to in the context of allergen management, and how an allergen control plan could be integrated in a food safety management plan. Once again, thank you very much, and I wish you a great continuation of the discussions today.
food allergen testing is also a key enabler in the efforts to manage food allergies and to manage food allergens. Food allergen testing is generally applied using a technique that we call Eliza-based techniques, so enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays. In the next segment, we will see an introduction of ELISAs and their application to food allergen testing and overall to food allergen management. This segment is brought to us by the sponsor of this broadcast, R Biopharm, a major food diagnostics organization offering a set of products and services related to the identification and characterization of food ingredients and contaminants.
If you are new to ELISA analyzers, the first question you will probably ask is, what do I need to start using ELISA? Well, you will need a pipette, plate washer, a computer with the software for calculation, and a reader. I think I've got one in my pocket. Here you go. This is your reader absorbance. No, I'm not kidding. This small device is a fully functional ELISA reader. You may wonder, where's the power supply? There's none. It's connected to your computer via USB and needs no additional power. Then you may ask about maintenance. Sorry, no moving mechanics inside, so it's good as maintenance free. And what if the lamps lose their light intensity over time? Not a problem, thanks to innovative LED technology. There's no degrees in light intensity as with conventional photometers with UV or halogen lamps. And that's not all. Also, it's so small, it's very powerful and fast. Featuring 96 detection units, it measures all cavities in parallel within just 5 seconds. Even more, it features 4 LEDs with different wavelengths and comes in a package with our software ReaderSoftWin. You see, size doesn't matter. With a footprint of just about 1 microtiter plate, you have a versatile, precise, fast and robust reader for your ELISA plates. Suitable for all reader screen ELISAs for food and feed analysis and clinical diagnostics. So if you want to start using ELISA, you can be sure this reader fits into your lab.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Simmet. I'm the International Sales Manager from R Biopharm. R Biopharm is a company that manufactures food and feed analytical test kits. We are based in Darmstadt, Germany. And today I'd like to give you some information on allergen analysis and allergen management. So we'll basically be looking at some of the tips and tricks and necessities when it comes to the analysis of allergens and why that is important in order to do allergen management. So to start off, we'll just have a look at the analysis of allergens itself. So here it's very important to understand that allergens are not purified proteins. So the allergenic substances which actually cause an allergic reaction and within the consumer are just part of an entity. So when we are looking for allergens in egg, for instance, we're not identifying a protein that covers egg entirely. For instance, we're not looking for a gene that identifies egg, but we are looking for the actual protein that causes the allergen. And we do know that allergens can be present in their native form, so basically in the raw material and in processed food. And this becomes very important when we are talking about the extraction. Native and processed allergens may show a different reactivity, and that's just something important to consider. We'll catch on to that later on when doing our allergen management. And here you can already see what I'm talking about when focusing on food processing. So on the left-hand side, we would have the native protein. And depending on the grade of processing, this protein will change. So on the right-hand side, for instance, we would have a hydrolyzed product, and the protein has been broken down quite considerably, building peptides. So as you can imagine, this already states a difficulty in itself when it comes down to actually finding the protein that we are looking for by using test methods. Just another example to make this more visual with cookies in the baking process. So on the left-hand side, you do have cookies that were baked at 120 degrees for 15 minutes. And on the right-hand side, they were cooked with 150 degrees for 15 minutes. And obviously, you can see that the coloring is different. I think all of us have already or may have burnt a cake in the oven, left it in for too long. You can see already on the outside that it has an impact on the food you are cooking or processing, and obviously you will have the same impact on the proteins you are looking for. And for allergen detection, it then becomes important what toolkit you use. So at our biofarm, for instance, when we are talking about our Eliza test kit systems, the reader screen line, we have two different types. So basically the sandwich Eliza, which will catch the entire protein, is used for basically non-processed foods or only lightly processed foods, the raw materials. The competitive Eliza, however, has the capability of actually looking for peptides. So that would be a test kit that you would use to look for highly processed foodstuffs, or for protein and peptides, the peptides of the protein in highly processed foodstuffs. So the difference here is that basically the test competes with the proteins that already are bound on the plate, and we will see that here. Basically, they compete with in the binding process with the proteins on the plate, and this causes a weaker signal. So the difference is basically the higher the signal is with sandwich Eliza, the higher the concentration of the allergen is. With the competitive one, the lower the signal is, the higher the concentration is. And this is basically a choice of tool that you will need to make depending on the matrix that you are testing. IFM also offers lateral flow test kits. These, however, basically are not competitive versions, but here again, a choice of tools depending on what you want to do. So these products, for instance, are ideal for allergen monitoring of production lines, of tools that are used in product manufacturing. So you can basically use them for swabbing to look if your kitchen or your production site is clean. And here we cover the majority of allergens of interest. So basically the big 8. And the same basically goes for the Elizas. However, the Eliza test kits do have a wider range of application, if you will. So it is absolutely possible that you do take a swabbing sample and then apply that to an Eliza test kit. The question is just, does that make sense? Depending on what you do. Here again, it's just important to make sure that you are using the right tools for your needs at the end of the day. And the same goes for PCR. So we do also offer PCR test kits, and here it's important to understand the difference that we are in the DNA for PCR. We are actually looking for the DNA, and that can have major benefits, but also downfalls on the other side. So, for instance, if we are looking for allergens that basically come from animal products, so let's say milk and egg, for instance, you will have troubles identifying those with the PCR, because the DNA of the milk and the egg can obviously be traced back to the animal. So if you have a positive sample, you will never be 100% sure that you are actually looking or finding the allergen, but potentially traces of chicken or beef, respectively. Which would absolutely be harmless for people suffering allergic reactions from milk and egg, for instance. So you would potentially be having false positives. On the other hand, if we look at allergens like celery, celery has such a high cross-reactivity that it's so far not been possible to actually bring out an ELISA test that is specific for celery. In these cases, the PCR test kits would be your absolute go-to product, because it can really pinpoint the allergen that you are looking for. Okay, so now we'll have a look at principles of allergen management and just give some examples of how these can be applied, or which tools to use in your day-to-day process. So we've just already been through the three different types of products of choice. So the lateral flows, the ELISAs, and the PCR. And as I already mentioned, cleaning efficiency of the product lines, lateral flows would absolutely be your best option here. For product testing, you could use PCR or ELISA. What you'd also need to consider is what kind of results are important for you. Are qualitative results okay, where you are basically just looking for a yes and no answer, is an allergen present or not? Or would you be interested in getting quantitative results, so basically knowing how much allergen is present? Then you would go for PCR or the ELISA, for instance. And another thing to consider is the number of samples that you're running. So is the sample volume very low? It then again makes sense to go with the lateral flow test or with the ELISAs. Or if you are screening many samples, it may make more sense to apply the PCR and the ELISA, just because it saves you a lot of time. So for allergen management, we basically have this overview here of the different steps. So basically, obviously, we need to look at the raw material when it comes into the factory. Then we need to actually look at the manufacturing process, and in the end, at the laboratory, the trade, and the commercial kitchen. So these are the three sectors, I'd say, where it's important to make sure that no allergens are present. So for instance, if we look at the procurement of raw materials, it would be important to check, is there a certificate of analysis coming with the goods that I have purchased? So has my supplier already checked for allergens, and then what method have they used? And it might even make sense to like run a full quality control audit on the supplier where you source your materials from. Another option would be for you to actually test the allergens during delivery control, during the incoming goods control. Quite a similar aspect as you would do it for mycotoxins, for instance. Another part of allergen management could be that you are separating allergenic materials from non-allergenic raw materials, just in order to make sure that there's no cross contamination between the materials. Another important thing to talk about is the labeling of allergens in this case, where it can absolutely make sense to look at what choice of labeling you choose. So icons may be much more effective than wordings because you may have the whole topic of translations issues. So if you are bringing in raw materials from importing them from a different country, it may be problematic if the allergen is only labeled in the language of the country that you have purchased it from. If icons are on the product, this is basically unilateral. Anybody will understand them. Another factor of cross-contamination is important. We've already touched on storage. Sorry. We do also get inquiries where people have tested garlic for peanut and say, yes, the test isn't working. There are false positive results for peanut in garlic. This is not the case. What actually happens very often is that there is already a cross-contamination on the field. So basically that the peanut has contaminated the garlic and is actually present in the garlic in the field, and this has then been transported to the production site. So in that case, it would not be a false positive, but a correct positive. But it is important to look at what raw materials can be contaminated already in the field. So in the manufacturing stage, there are also things that you can do. So basically the bundling of production processes that you only produce allergenic produce in one go, and then basically switch the entire line, clean it, and then produce non-allergenic products that will again prevent the risk of cross-contamination. Having completely separate production lines, so one production line only for allergenic material, another production line for non-allergenic material. And if you really want to take it to the extreme, you can also separate buildings. So you would have, for instance, a building that has a milk ban or an egg ban. So no raw materials containing milk or egg would be allowed into this building. However, it's important to consider, if you do this, that you will also, or it makes sense to have your lab outside of these buildings, because some test systems work with skimmed milk powder, for instance, which are used to boost signals. Skimmed milk powder wouldn't even be allowed in the lab if you are consequent with this concept. So those are things to consider. And obviously cleaning controls throughout manufacturing with swabbing, but you can also test your rinse water. Basically after cleaning, test the water itself and just see if allergens have been taken up in the cleaning process. And that is an indicator for you that the manufacturing site may still contain allergens or not. Okay, then in the final step, obviously, we will have the quality assurance, and this can happen obviously at the stage where the final product comes out, so the quality control, but also at the end user site, if you like, or at the site where product and end user, the consumer, come together. So in the commercial kitchen, for instance, in a restaurant or in a canteen. And in this case, obviously, you would be taking samples of the final product and then testing that for the allergens. So usually in this case, you would be using Eliza or PCR. However, if you are doing a commercial kitchen, it may also make sense to run a swabbing test of the surfaces and of the tools needed. So in a nutshell, it's just important to monitor the entire process from farm to fork. Now, we did mention cross-contamination happening on the field, so this is literally at the farm, but we should also look at at the stages where the food and the consumer come together, as cross-contaminations can happen quite easily depending on the allergen. And in general, quality assurance in the food chain comes from standardizing manufacturing processes, and we've talked about that. Standardized food analysis, so which method do you use? And both of that obviously will bring together consumer safety. Thank you very much for paying attention and giving me the time to talk about this topic today. As I said, if you have any questions, please take note, and the organizers can forward them to us, but we will also be present at tomorrow's session, the 21st of November, I believe that is correct. Yes, it is. So we will also be there in person, and you'll be able to address us. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for having us. All the best. Bye-bye.
Do you know what the second most common allergy in childhood is after milk allergy? Peanuts? Soy? No, it's eggs. Yes, these versatile and nutritious foods are one of the most common allergy triggers worldwide. Approximately 4 to 6% of children are affected. Undeclared eggs in food are a major problem for allergic people, as you can see in this figure. Most allergen-related food recalls are due to undeclared milk, followed by cereals containing gluten. Food alerts by egg and products thereof are with 12% already in the third place. So eggs bear a high risk of remaining undiscovered. Avoiding eggs in the diet isn't easy. Because of their technological characteristics, eggs are a popular additive in the food industry and are used in a variety of processed foods, even where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. For example, eggs serve as a binding agent in noodles and as an emulsifier in sauces. They add fluffiness to biscuits and provide a delicate yellow color. The egg white can be used for the fining of wine, and the lysosome in the egg serves as a preservative. To protect people with egg allergy from unintentional consumption, eggs must be labeled as an allergen in most countries. To ensure correct labeling, test systems are available for measuring the egg content in food. However, most test systems only detect native egg protein, so they can't be used for processed foods. That is why we have developed the reader screen egg, an ELISA test that detects the egg proteins which cause the allergic reaction in native as well as processed form. Convenient procedure, reliable results. Reader screen egg, ensuring safe food for people with egg allergy.
During this talk, I will be focusing on the food allergen community, and I will attempt to share with you some of the accomplishments of the community and the future direction, starting, of course, with the inception of the food allergen community and the history of the development of such a community. Now, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the area of food allergen and gluten detection became an important one. In fact, in a number of jurisdictions around the world, food allergen-related recalls topped the number of food recalls, and that was certainly the case in a number of countries in North America and Canada. Started to see that also in the United States, as well as in other jurisdictions like in the Southwest Pacific. All this was very much driven also by the development of an international standard in 1998, mandating the declaration of priority allergens when they are added as ingredient as part of the composition of food. And of course, immediately upon the adoption of this standard and the translation of this international standard in a number of national and domestic food safety and food quality rules, the question was immediately posed: how do we enable the enforcement of such a rule, and how do we enable also the conformity assessment against such requirements, not only for the presence of ingredients in food, but also for situations related to cross-contamination with food allergens and cross-contamination or adventitious presence of allergens was started to be identified as an issue. And in fact, it was correlated with a number of food allergy incidents. It was therefore quite natural that AOAC looked at the issue of allergen methodologies, gluten detection methodologies, and in the early 2000s, a presidential task force on food allergens was set up with the objective to inform the association standardization work in relation with this area, with the area of food allergens. The task force was chaired by Dr. Jupiter Young and by the late Sue Hafley from the Food Allergy Research and Resource Program of the University of Nebraska. I managed to find these two pictures with both Jupiter and Sue, and I'm sure that many of you remember the tremendous contribution of these two leaders in the area of food allergens. Of course, many other contributors and many other colleagues shaped what the task force was and how the task force operated and how it evolved progressively towards a community. The main objective of the task force at the time when it was set was to advise AOAC International through the president of the organization on initiatives that AOAC should carry out as part of its standard setting mandate on food allergens as well as gluten. Now, with the continued interest in this area, it wasn't strange to see that this time-limited initiative in the form of a task force moved progressively towards the creation of a community. And one of the objectives, of course, pursued was to sustain the interventions. It was clearly identified that the area of food allergens was here to stay and was to continue to be an important area of food safety and quality to be looked after both by the food production sector, but also by the food regulatory community. At the time, a number of justification requirements were needed in order for us essentially to make the case for the creation of the food allergen community. And in fact, it wasn't a difficult task to justify the relevance of the creation of an AOAC food allergen community. There were a number of needs that needed to be addressed, and one of them was related to the availability of methods. At the time, there were only a handful number of commercially available test kits, and a number of common food allergens remained not covered by methods that allowed their detection and their quantification. And that was identified as a gap by the stakeholder community. A second need was related to validated methods. Although a number of commercially available test kits were made available, in fact, the number of externally validated methods was considered to be quite low, and validated methods are needed to detect and quantify food allergens in food, and these methods were identified as a must to support regulatory and trade requirements, as well as to support risk assessment, so essentially to support the estimation of dietary exposure to food allergens. The need for reference materials, or the need for samples that contained known amounts of allergens and that would be representative of food commodities, was also identified as something that the community needed to address. Choosing a reference material for use in an allergen method validation is considered to be extremely challenging, and the right representative material is not easy to identify. Different species of the same food commodity may have different protein profiles. Processing methods can have a drastic effect on the protein content, on the conformation of the protein, on the protein solubility and reactivity. In general, a reference material is identified as a material that is representative of the allergenic food commodity, that is well characterized, that can be produced or supplied with a robust, reproducible characteristics, and which can be used as a calibration standard potentially, or as a control, or as also a spiking materials. So because food allergens can be present in so many different forms, processed and unprocessed, with quite divergent characteristics and functions in food, we identified that it was unlikely to have a single material that may represent many, that could represent the various possibilities and the various options that may happen. And we needed guidance, and we needed guidance on the availability of these reference materials that will facilitate the fortification experiments, in particular in the production of these in-house verification samples, or what we call the incurred samples. So essentially, those are food samples that are manufactured under real-life conditions, containing a known amount of a food allergen. So you see that this is something that we identified back in 2006, 2007. And in fact, a couple of days ago, as part of the discussion of the food allergen program, it is in fact an active file and an active area of consideration by the community. Another need was also identified, and for which guidance was required, is the need for sampling protocols. Contaminations of foods with undeclared food allergens can often take place in a non-homogeneous environment and in a non-homogeneous fashion. For this reason, appropriate sampling plans are required in order to obtain a reasonable level of certainty that the food allergen, if it was present, would be able to be caught, if you will, during sampling, and that the level would be correctly identified and determined. And more, globally, the need for confidence in analytical results was clearly something that was expressed at the time. And the global regulatory community required, and still does, require reliable analytical methods to make science-based decisions, and to trust each other's data and the outputs, essentially, of the decision-making process. And methods needed to be validated, needed to be chosen with a fit for purpose, and a number of criteria needed to be developed. For example, acceptance criteria of methodologies needed to be developed, amongst other things, and to create a level of confidence, in fact, of the acceptability of the performance of these methods, both by food regulators, but also by the food production sector. And these needs were clearly expressed not within a single jurisdiction, but at the international level. So, in fact, the need for internationally recognized methods was clearly expressed, and I guess our organization, AOAC International, had the solution to offer some answers and to provide the guidance needed and to benefit essentially from the contribution of the various expertise of the membership and of its stakeholders to offer a response to these challenges. Now, when the community was created, we developed, in fact, terms of reference of the community, and the mission was spelled out as follows: to serve the AOAC International in a consensus-based scientific and advisory capacity on methods of analysis for food allergens and other, and this is for food allergens in food, but also potentially in other commodities. Food allergens can be ingredients, can be non-active ingredients in dietary supplements, for example, or in other products such as therapeutic products. So the community was also tasked to provide advice on all technical factors that can impact the confidence in analytical results, including the needs for fit-for-purpose methods, method selection, development and evaluation, as well as quality assurance, such as also training, reference materials development, and proficiency testing. The responsibilities of the community of this group. So this is in fact a group of experts, a group of stakeholders that come together to constitute the community. And the community was meant essentially to reach out to the various stakeholders in government, in academia, in industry, in trade associations, and bring together these stakeholders to help identify by consensus what are the needs in the area of food allergen testing, to ensure active participation of these stakeholders through scheduled, whether be it face-to-face meetings or virtual meetings, including in fact a formal meeting during the AOAC International annual meeting. The community also committed to developing and applying a prioritization process to address the community's need for analytical methods, to facilitate the availability of validated methods for the detection and the determination of allergens in food. We expressed also the interest of forming potential subgroups as required to address prioritized analytical methods needs, to take an active leadership role in directing and steering the work of these subgroups to meet the identified analytical methods need of the community, and to take an active leadership role to ensure also that the work of the experts contributing in this area would be achieved, again, following the values of AOAC International, the values of consensus, the values of transparency and inclusiveness with the contribution of the various identified stakeholders. And now, a number of areas of work were identified from the start, definitely developing guidance documents on the validation of food allergens and contributing to the availability of these externally validated methods amongst those commercially available test kits was clearly identified as a top priority. Support in the identification of reference material and promote their availability through providing again guidance that a number of institutions that have the expertise and the leadership in the development of such materials so that they can take it on and make it available. And that's what NIST and other organizations such as the IRMM, for example, did throughout the past period. The development of sampling protocols for food allergens that could be used by the food production sector, but also by food regulators in the context of conducting their business, and the development of advice on the suitability of the various alternative methods, particularly we identified, for example, that there was a need for confirmatory methods for food allergens, and more guidance is needed to be provided in this particular area. Now, the community was considered to be key, in fact, to support the official processes of AOAC, particularly within the context of the Official Methods Board, and to champion essentially the best practices or the development of best practices in the area of interlaboratory collaborative study and the adoption of AOAC official methods that would target priority food allergens. So this is in fact what the community was meant to be, and that's what it took on from its inception in 2008. So we see, if my memory serves me right, the community was created, or essentially the work of the task force morphed into the work of the community as of 2008. Now, perhaps if we want to speak about some key accomplishments of the community, if there are two papers that would highlight, in fact, these accomplishments, these are the two papers that were published in the AOAC journal, two major guidance documents paving the way for the development of standards method performance requirements for allergens, was published in 2010. In fact, it was a process that the community started in 2007 and that was pursued over a couple of years to reach this consensus document that became, in fact, Appendix M. And also another paper that was published in 2013 and also that represented the culmination of about 3 years of work started in the late 2009, 2010, and essentially ending up with this consensus paper with the contribution of a number of stakeholders and partners in this particular area. Now, the community has been a driver for the increase of a number of commercially available methods for allergens and gluten. When we compare where we are now and where we have been at the start of the work in the early 2000s, the number of externally validated allergen methodologies is now way, way bigger. The number of reference materials that is commercially available is also has increased considerably. Peanut material, egg material, and we're seeing, in fact, now that the reliance on allergen methods in practices of food safety and food quality control and the inclusion of these methods as one of the tools in food safety management systems has become practically a routine practice. And we have witnessed the added understanding about the performance of food allergen methods. Now, this area continues to be an active area of interest, and the community, in fact, saw a number of leaders. I had the privilege to be a co-chair of the community with Dr. Jupiter Young. Currently, the community is led by Dr. Carmen Diaz, and we've seen definitely a jump in the way the community communicates amongst each other, reaches out, uses also all the various tools that are available, social media, publications that are available and that take advantage of the active contribution of the membership and make available, update, engage in a number of discussion groups. And we saw a renewal of the activities of the community in starting in 2016 with the interest to further structure the work of the community through the creation of working groups. A working group, in fact, on food allergen and gluten was created and was guided by a thought leaders process that identified a number of priorities. And in fact, that has led to the development of a number of standard method performance requirements, so SMPRs that were published for peanut, egg, and milk. Subsequent to that, we saw the level of interest that food allergens and gluten constitutes. This was renewed by more activity on the part of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. Codex resurrected some areas of work, or put on its agenda, in fact, a number of areas of work in relation with food allergens as part of CCFH, the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, which published a guidance document essentially for food industries in the form of a code of practice to manage food allergens. We've seen more recently interest on the part of CCFL to manage the issues related to precautionary labeling and to offer a more concerted approach amongst the international community and the various stakeholders on how these statements could be used, but also to provide guidance on risk assessment for food allergens. And in fact, most recently, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, so JECFA, with the identification of a priority, for example, to work on thresholds related to food allergens, published, in fact, a number of updates in this regard. Now, AOAC International identified again the importance of this area of work and created a program, a comprehensive and structured program to continue to support the activities of our organization and to address the needs of stakeholders in method standardization related to food allergens and gluten. Those two working groups, one was dedicated to food allergens and is led by Professor Melanie Downs from FARP, the Food Allergy Research and Resource Program of the University of Nebraska. And the second is related to gluten and is led by Dr. Laura Allred. And a number of areas are on the agenda of these working groups. The performance of lateral flow devices, for example, for gluten. The way to characterize that and the way that methods need to be validated when they are using this format. The need to better understand the performance of allergen methods and to better document that was clearly expressed as a priority for the food allergen working group, and work is underway there. And we continue to have discussions on providing guidance on the availability of these in-house incurred samples that are needed for method verification or for method validation. For those who had the opportunity to attend the discussions of this annual meeting, where we reviewed some of the outputs of these working groups, you saw how active these working groups are, and we continue to invite all the stakeholders and our partners and the experts in this area to consider joining the program and to join the working groups and to offer their expertise and their contribution in this area. So needless to say that the food allergen community will continue to be an engine of development and progress for the validation and the adoption of the standardized methods, hopefully in the upcoming years for food allergens and gluten methods. So I hope that this overview was useful in providing you really some insights as to how the community came together and some of the highlights of its accomplishments. Once again, I really am privileged to be part of this community of work and look forward to our continued progress in this area. Thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Once again, I would like to thank all contributors to the development of this first live broadcast. I would like to mention specifically one of our GFoRSS actors, Dr. Eli Bouyazbek, who has been really at the helm of preparing this first programming, but also thank all the contributors from Food Allergy Canada and our sponsor, ARB Biopharm. Most of all, thank you all for joining us in this live broadcast or joining us later in reviewing the material that was developed as part of this first broadcast of GFoRSS TV.
Global Food Regulatory Science Society. GFoRSS mission includes knowledge generation and dissemination, underpinning food regulatory decisions, in support of food control systems, Our interventions focus on promoting food regulatory scientific disciplines. Consistent reliance on food regulatory sciences enables robust food control programs. Contributing to more resilient food systems and a safe, accessible, abundant and nutritious food supply.